Welcome everyone, Costin here with a discussion about Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires and about the best campaigns currently in the game for Legendary difficulty. If you're an experienced player, if you know what you're doing, and you want to have a good solid experience that you will enjoy, not just in the early game, but throughout most if not all of your campaign, these campaigns are the ones that I would recommend. But what makes a campaign the best? Well, difficulty, first off. And when I talk about difficulty, I'm not just talking about the early game difficulty. There's a lot of legendary lords in the game that may have a very difficult early game start. For instance, Cetra over here has an incredibly difficult start in his campaign. But once you overcome, if you do overcome that early game situation, his campaign is just a steamroll where you overwhelm every enemy that is in your path. So it's not really a great campaign because you have a very difficult early game, but then you have a cakewalk of a late game or a mid to late game. And that's, by the way, a trap a lot of campaigns can certainly fall into. So that's one of the things. I would say that the best campaigns are the ones where you have a smoother difficulty curve throughout the entire experience, where it can be challenging, but not too ridiculously challenging in the early game, but also challenging to varying degrees in the mid game and in the late game. And very few campaigns that we currently have for Immortal Empires are like that. On top of that, there's also the question of racial mechanics. The legendary lords in question, the mechanics they have, the faction benefits. Those are the things I would personally consider. How good is the race to play? How good are the mechanics of that race? How good are the mechanics of that legendary lord? Or will you experience frustration playing through one of those campaigns? And this is where I stand on this issue. What I think makes a good campaign. At number 5, we have Xiao Ming of Grand Cathay, or also Miao Ying. They're pretty close to each other, though I personally think Xiao Ming's campaign is the better of the two. It certainly got a lot more potential throughout it, whereas Miao Ying is a bit more limited, won't generate as much money, though I've talked about the Legendary Lords of Grand Cathay in several videos already. But Cathay is a pretty good faction. It's got a solid army, a solid unit roster. The only downside that Cathay does have is limited casualty replenishment, so it can be difficult to recover from some battles, unless of course you're using the whooshing compass to be able to get the casualty replenishment over here from the Great Bastion specifically when we're talking about it. Though of course if you go for that, you're potentially losing out on a good amount of income. But beyond that, when we're looking at Grand Cathay, what's great about a Grand Cathay campaign is that Cathay itself, as a region of the game, is one of the best in the entire game. A good variety of terrain, good variety of factions. Beyond the Cathayan factions themselves, you also have Vampire Counts, the Vampire Coast, the Lizardmen, the Wood Elves, Dark Elves, and Skaven. And of course Chaos over here in the north. So there is a great variety of opponents to deal with that can present an actual challenge in that campaign. Especially when it comes to dealing with Deathmaster Snitch, and to a certain degree of course Lokhir and Village, though they're certainly lesser threats than the threat that Snitch is going to pose in this campaign. Furthermore, once you do overcome that, once you manage to secure your early game situation, what you have to look forward to in the mid and late game is the major threat of Grimgor over here from Saber Mountain. So he's certainly going to present a genuine challenge in your campaign. He's going to bring a lot of armies to bear against you. And thus, when you do encounter Grimgor and you have to fight them, you are going to be in a position where you're going to be able to bring a lot of armies yourself if you've conquered Cathay fairly quickly in that campaign, and so you're going to have quite a bit of a fun back and forth between yourself and Grimgor. And then once you overcome Grimgor, there are of course other threats to the west, to the north, Kolek if he's still alive, Archeon potentially, though there is certainly a major problem when we're talking about Cathay, any Cathay campaign, and that's the issue of terrain and suitable climate that they do have. See, Cathay is a great region, but you're limited in terms of where you can expand, because you just can't take a lot of climate types. Like if we're looking at the climate types, we can get savanna, we can get temperate, and we can get desert. The problem is, outside of Cathay itself, the neighboring regions are unpleasant climates. I mean, sure, you could go into Khemri, you could go into Araby, you could go into the Empire, Tylea, and Estalia if you get there, but that's going to be pretty far away from your core territories. But if you do overcome that distance and you do end up in the Empire, you can certainly expand there and have a bunch of fun playing as Grand Cathay that far west. But there are certainly going to be limitations when it comes to it. But just the fact that you are going to be dealing with things like Snitch, Lokhir, and Grimgore, and you have the tools to do it. You have the economic tools, you have the army. The only downside is, of course, when it comes to replenishment. The only major downside is when it comes to replenishment. It can make this a pretty fun campaign, either as Yao Ming or Miao Ying. Beyond the terrain, the biggest annoyance, of course, with Cathay is the yin and yang system, but it's certainly something you can deal with. But I certainly take away points from the limited terrain types that they can colonize, as well as the annoyances that you will experience from the yin and yang system. But I can heartily recommend playing a Grand campaign as any of the factions that actually starts here. But I think Cathay itself, on Legendary, will provide a fairly solid experience. Number 4, we have Oyxotl. Now, Oyxotl may not have the hardest campaign in the world. In quite a lot of ways, in fact, it could be considered a cakewalk, with the exception of dealing with Kairos in the early game. So what you do as Oyxotl, you start expanding east, you deal with this minor faction of Khorne, then this minor faction of Tzeentch, then you end up having to face Kairos. Though you do have a stronger army than Kairos, but defeating him certainly will not be a cakewalk, and actually taking over the entirety of the Southern Chaos Wastes can be a bit of a problem. Because you're not just dealing with the Southern Chaos Wastes, you also have the Visions of the Old Ones missions across the entire world. Basically, you get missions that, if you do them, you get significant faction benefits. If you don't do them, you may have severe drawbacks. Some more so than others when it comes to your campaign. Some of them you may not care about, but some of them you do. But what's great about this campaign is you're basically playing Lizardmen XCOM, where you do have your core territory and you want to expand that across the Southern Chaos Waste and deal with Kairos, but you also have to go around the world putting down fires, so to speak. Now, what's great about this campaign is the amount of flexibility that you have in it, more so than any other legendary lord in the campaign. See, because you get these missions to generally deal with chaotic factions or vampire factions or evil factions in general, if you will, or disorder factions, if you will, then that means you can teleport to active front lines where there might be some actual enjoyment to be had in a campaign, as opposed to just slowly, ever so slowly expanding across your territory and not encountering a lot of opposition past the early game. This is, by the way, a problem for a lot of campaigns, that the early game might be difficult, but once you've stabilized your front line and you start expanding, especially in a certain direction only, then you will just be able to steamroll your opponents. For Oyxotl, given his teleportation mechanic, you have the ability to get engaged in active war zones or in other areas of the map where there might be a lot more happening than on your front line. And that makes this campaign very fun to play, and also makes it difficult, but not ridiculously so. Though, to be fair, difficult is not necessarily the word you wouldn't necessarily associate with Oyxotl. Like, you can make it difficult, I think, is a better way to say it, if you do decide to go get engaged in another active front line. Though Oyxotl certainly has a very powerful army with the Chameleon Skinks and Chameleon Stalkers. He can genuinely kite an army to death. He does have a powerful army, and you can use that army to get engaged against severe threats from very early on in his campaign. Like, say, for instance, let's say that during the course of a campaign, you get a mission here near the challenge zone. Well, that means you can end up picking a fight with Grimgore, and that would be a genuinely fun and engaging encounter, and you can challenge yourself as a player, if you so choose, by trying to take over the entirety of the Mountains of Morn, while also trying to hold your empire here in the Southern Cast Wastes, and also having to manage the missions that you will get. So there's a lot of things on offer for Oyxotl during the course of his campaign, and I think it is a genuinely fun campaign and a really engaging one overall. A bit too easy when it comes to individual battles, in the sense that, yeah, his army is just going to demolish everything in his path in an open field battle especially, but certainly can be challenging on a campaign situation if you do decide to play like that. You could choose not to and have a very easy campaign, but you can also have a very dynamic and difficult campaign if you so desire it. And I think that's the great thing about Oyxotl's campaign, and why I'd recommend a lot of people play this one on Legendary difficulty in particular, because there's a lot of things to enjoy about this one. At number 3, we have Boris Ursus of Kislev. Now, this may be surprising to a lot of people. I mean, I've made a lot of videos on this channel talking about the many issues that Kislev has, and it does have them. However, Boris Ursus is actually a very enjoyable Legendary Lord to play, because he makes use of the strengths that Kislev has without many of the drawbacks. I mean, he still has the economic drawback. He'll still have to worry about the devotion scaling in terms of how much it costs to invoke a god throughout the course of his campaign, but he really makes the Kislev campaign work in the best possible fashion, given the current mechanics and unit roster that the faction does have. So let's talk about this. He starts here near the Tower of Torment. Now, you could decide during the course of a campaign to stick here in his starting province, take it over, end up in a war with both Archaon and the Demon Prince early on in the game. That is one possibility. It's also the more difficult possibility, but some people do enjoy a really difficult early game. Or alternatively, you could abandon your starting province, come back later, go for the Frozen Landing province, go for Prague, take Prague over, take advantage of that situation. And here's where the strengths that Boris does have will come into play. So you can easily take Prague over to establish as a capital for your empire, if you will. Now, Boris does start with the Patriarch, so right off the bat, he is going to have really good casualty replenishment. He also starts with heavily armored units, which are going to do very well in Auto-Resolve, because heavily armored units do better in Auto-Resolve, take fewer casualties, and give you higher odds. So starting with 2 Tsar Guard, 2 Armored Cossars, and 2 Warbear Riders is going to make a lot of the early game battles far easier to tackle. And certainly Kislev, if you're playing as Kostaltin or Katrin, can be an absolute nightmare in the early game, but not for Boris Ursus. Even if you do decide to fight Archaon, you're well positioned to be able to do so. Just keep in mind, this is a campaign that I'm sure Creative Assembly designed for you to fight in this initial province. That's doable, but if you decide to leave, you can have a very easy early game, but that doesn't mean you'll have an easy campaign, to be clear, because you will still have to deal with Frot, Azazel, Norskan, so Trog, Wulfric, the Demon Prince, Archaon, and of course others, including people like Azag, Draika, etc. In fact, the best campaign plan as Boris Ursus is to leave your starting province, go for Prague, take that over, deal with Frot one way or another, then go take over Sylvania for an economic hub. So you're fighting Vlad, you're fighting Azag, you're fighting Draika, and you're well positioned to take all of them on and win, and have a lot of fun doing so. That's just the early to mid-game situation. Then you're going to be dealing with Archaon. So you are going to be fighting a lot of threats, but you do have the tools in order to succeed against those threats. One of the bigger problems that you're going to face playing a Kislev faction that's not Boris is the supporter system. But as Boris, you don't have to care about the supporter system. Sure, you can throw supporters to the Ice Court or the Orthodoxy, but if you decide to not care about the supporter system at all throughout the entire campaign, the only thing you're missing are some temporary buffs, either in growth with the Ice Court or in control if you do support the Orthodoxies. And you can certainly make do without that. You may also ignore the invocations, because generally the invocations, their main purpose, beyond the benefits you can get on the campaign map, the main benefit of the invocations is to give you supporters. So you don't have to care about that. You have a good starting army, a good starting situation, and you can ignore 2 of the annoying mechanics that Kislev has during the course of its campaign. On top of that, the problem with the supporter system is that if you're playing Catherine or Castalton, you need to get to 600 supporters to confederate the other. So if you're playing Catherine or Castalton, it's going to take you a very long time to be able to take, say, Erengard as Catherine or Kislev as Castalton. But as Boris, you can just confederate. Hell, you can even declare war on them and just literally take those cities if you so desire. Though you will incur a devotion cost if you do end up fighting other Kislevite campaigns. This campaign can also be really good if you get a mod that gives you devotion from all enemies, so you can get it from fighting Draika, Azak, and Vlad, which I think would be pretty appropriate. I mean, I don't think devotion from the Empire makes much sense, or the Dwarves, but from Vlad, from Azak, from Draika, would make a good amount of sense from my perspective. Then you do have faction-wide benefits that help you with construction costs, construction time, growth, colonization. Boris has a special skill here that allows him to resettle a region that's been burned to the ground, something that Cass tends to do quite often at no cost. So that's a fairly significant campaign benefit that you can get there. On top of that, he can also colonize a lot of the territories that are near him. So you can get frozen climate, you can get mountain climate, he can get the wasteland. This is because in the Realms of Chaos, he starts in the Darklands, so it makes sense for him to be able to colonize the wasteland. So a lot of the territory, the vast majority of territory that surrounds him, is something he can take over. And even in the Chaos Wastelands, although it's unpleasant, he does get the devotion benefit from it. So it's not like you're just losing from being in the Chaos Wastelands if you're playing as Boris. That gives you greater flexibility in the campaign, that gives you greater opportunities to expand, and makes the campaign overall better to deal with. On top of that, on top of that, you do have some fairly good benefits when it comes to battles and when it comes to some of the units that you will want to use, like Tsar Guard, Warbear Riders, which are really, really good units. And certainly Boris is the strongest of the Kislevite legendary lords in a campaign, and I think certainly one of the better campaigns to play in the game. A bit annoying having to deal with Kislev, but this isn't a free ride, so to speak. It might be easy early on, but once you start dealing with Archaon, once you start picking those fights with Archaon, the Demon Prince, and others, and of course Norska, things do go in a very different direction. In fact, you might face the entirety of the unified Norska playing as Boris, because what can happen in a campaign, it doesn't usually happen, but it can, is that Wulfric defeats Trog, and defeats the other Norscan factions, unifies all of Norska, so thus you have a massive empire to deal with, potentially from very early on in the campaign, or at the very least from the mid-game. And then later on, of course, you've got Sigvald potentially to deal with, Kolic, Grimgor, all those threats. And you do have different expansion paths if you do decide to play a campaign as Boris Ursus. You can go south, you can go east, you can go west. You have a lot of options, and having those options can make a campaign much better. Number 2, we have Lokhir, Fellheart of the Dark Elves. Now, the Dark Elves are a really good race in Warhammer 3, but they do have some downsides, which means that they can't just steamroll the map without any problems whatsoever. For them, the main problem that they're going to have is going to come down to control due to their slave mechanic. So they do have a bunch of upsides, but they also have plenty of downsides. They also lack global recruitment, and instead have to use black arcs instead. There are significant benefits, of course, with black arcs, but of course they create a vulnerability. So there's quite a few pros and quite a few cons when you're playing the Dark Elves. But overall, it just creates a fairly good and balanced race in a lot of ways that isn't just going to be capable of steamrolling its enemies, which is something that is lacking a lot in a lot of races that are generally good. Like the Greenskins just are a tide of death that cannot be stopped in any way, shape, or form, where the only downside is the lack of trade, and even then you don't really care about that because you're going to make so much money. As the Dark Elves, you actually have to manage your empire correctly. That's one key element from my perspective when it comes to that. Furthermore, Dark Elves do have a good army roster that they can use. They have good heroes, they have good lords, they have good units. But not necessarily the best units in the game. They're not Warriors of Chaos or Greenskin level strength when it comes to their units. And they aren't capable of massing as many units as the Greenskins are, or getting the absurd level of vassal units to help them out, as is the case with the Warriors of Chaos. So they have strength, but it's not absurd levels of strength. Beyond that, for Lokhir specifically, the main strengths of his campaign that make it so good is the actual position itself. So you're in Cathay, and as I've established in a number of videos, Cathay is one of the best areas in the campaign. Now, as Lokhir, you won't be able to settle in mountain regions. They're uninhabitable, so same goes for the desert. But you can make deals with Snitch and conquer Cathay together, and then go elsewhere. So the early game, you're going to be dealing with the Vampire Coast, then Vampire Counts, then Nakai, and eventually end up in a protracted conflict, potentially with Xiao Ming and Miao Ying. Though if you help Snitch out against Miao Ying, he will help you out in turn to deal with the threat that Xiao Ming poses during the course of a campaign. After that, you shouldn't go west, though you can, but obviously the uninhabitable terrain is going to create issues. So it's in your best interest to make a deal with Snitch, have him occupy the western territories, and let him deal with Grimgor, maybe help him out with a couple of armies, or station some armies here in the wastelands, which you can take over to help him out to contain Gorst and Grimgor while you head elsewhere. But that's just the early game situation. Here's the great thing about Lokhir's campaign. Victory conditions wise, short campaign victory does require you to take certain critical territories in Cathay, but the long campaign victory conditions do require you to deal with the Elven factions, including Emmerich, so you're probably going to have to bite the bullet and send some armies to deal with Emmerich over here, potentially before you do decide to head further east, or rather west, if you will, via the shipping lanes. What's great about this campaign, though, is once you've taken over Cathay, and maybe dealt with Emmerich if you so desire, or you could put it off until much later with respect to that. But what you can do is head over into Lustria. The thing is, by the point you arrive in Lustria, you're going to have a hell of a fight over there, because Lord Skrolk is going to be wiped out pretty quickly on Legendary, and so Itza and the Cult of Sotek will control the entirety of the southern part of Lustria, with the exception of the territories that Rakarth will help. So you're going to be there to bail out Rakarth or knock his head in, and then take over his territory for himself. And then you can colonize the entirety of Lustria for yourself until you meet Marathi, and you start heading into Wolfwan. So you've got a campaign where the early game you do have challenges, because Cathay generally beats Snitch on their own, and then there's still the issues of Emmerich and Grimgor and Gorst to deal with one or another. The mid game is going to be all about fighting the factions of Lustria, which is going to be a great challenge, or a decent level of challenge, given the fact that by the time you're arriving, Skrolk will be wiped out and they'll control pretty much all of this territory, unless they end up being too weakened by the fights against Alberic and against Rakarth, maybe even the Hunts Marshal. By the way, there is a decent level of challenge to be had in most campaigns, especially if Oyxotl gets into the fray, because Oyxotl tends to become one of the more powerful factions of the game. And then, as the end game, you have all of Ulthuan to deal with the massive doom stacks that Ulthuan will be able to produce. This makes for a great and engaging campaign throughout. Lokhir also gets benefits, of course, to Black Arcs. He gets benefits to Black Arc Corsairs. He has a significant amount of economic potential. He can get a lot of money for sacking settlements. He's got a lot going for him in his campaign, from Lord effects to faction effects to starting position. But it's not just the starting position. There are many Lords which can have a great starting position or a good early game, but then their mid game or their late game becomes really boring. Generally both. For most campaigns, it's the only engaging part is the early game. For Lokhir, the entire portion of the campaign is enjoyable from start to finish, and you will always have a level of challenge to deal with as you're expanding across Cathay, then Lustria, then Ulfwan. So it makes for a really good campaign, a really solid campaign to engage in. And even if you conquer all of Ulfwan, then you can head over to the lands of the Empire, which you can also colonize. Quite a bit of the Empire can be ripe for the taking. So it makes for a really solid and engaging campaign when you are playing as Lokhir. In a way, the other Dark Elven factions just simply are not, from my perspective. Like, Morathi can be pretty good. Malekith can be pretty good if you overcome his early game situation. But I would say Lokhir is the best overall campaign to play as the Dark Elves. He's not the most powerful necessarily in terms of pure combat ability, but he does have a lot on offer for you to enjoy, on legendary difficulty especially. And number 1 is Anar of the High Elves. Might be a bit of a surprising choice because it can feel like Anar is just going to have a cakewalk campaign. But anyone who's played this campaign will tell you this is not so. Now, Anar does have significant bonuses. Every army in his faction will have the stock chance as their default movement stat, so they have a chance to ambush. It's not a great chance to ambush, but they do have it by default when they're moving forces. So that can give you significant advantages in battle. On top of that, you also can use the Shadow Realms, basically the underway, to traverse terrain, which can give you a significant campaign advantage. But here's the thing. While Anar has great bonuses, he gets bonuses in campaign movement range, global recruitment, he has good lord effects, he has a good army, he gets the chances of ambushing. He's not so great in combat himself, but he does have some really good campaign benefits. But here's the thing. Although all those campaign benefits, as well as start position, make his early game relatively easy to deal with when we're thinking about dealing with Karin Carr and then Silostra, though I wouldn't underestimate the potential that Silostra has to offer over here, because she can produce quite a few units and product against you, but your army is significantly better. But here's the thing. Anar's campaign, while it might be easy within the first few turns, is one of the very few campaigns where the difficulty actually ramps up as you play it. The vast majority of campaigns in this game are campaigns where the early game on Legendary is the most difficult part of it, the mid game is easier, and the late game is a cakewalk with the exception of the end game crisis, and even the end game crisis isn't necessarily something all that special. For Anar, that's exactly the opposite, especially when we're thinking about the mid game. Because once you capture the Granite Hills and once you've captured the Broken Lands, congratulations, you've gotten a peninsula. And it is very exposed to the enemies that you're going to face. Like, you want to expand west, you want to deal with Malekith, but you're not just going to be able to march against Tarax and Malekith and just take them over. No. Because what's going to happen, once you deal with Karin Carr and Silostra at about the same time you're finished dealing with them, Tarax is going to come into play, maybe Malekith will come into play, though generally Malekith takes out Grombrindal before he comes for you. So that's the buffer you have. But one faction that is going to come for you is Hellebron. And while dealing with Hellebron isn't necessarily that difficult, especially if you get tier 3 settlements with the very powerful wall towers that can annihilate entire armies, it does mean that you're always constantly going to face pressure throughout the course of your campaign until you eliminate those threats. But here's the thing. Even as you're expanding your territory, every time you expand, you're always going to meet another enemy. Like if you expand west, oh, you dealt with Tarax, congrats, you just met Morathi. Oh, and potentially Malekith. Oh, you want to take out Hellebron? Congratulations, you've got Valkia and Sigvald to deal with now. Oh, and best part, you're close enough to Be'lakor, who will declare war on you almost early in your campaign and come to wipe you out. You do have the tools of dealing with each of these threats, but every step of the way as you expand, you're going to meet more and more threats. Like if you expand north, you encounter Valkia and Sigvald. Fighting both of those can be a bit of a challenge. So let's say you decide, okay, screw Hellebron, I'm just going to march directly against her. Never mind the fact that Hellebron herself is a decent enough challenge if you invade her core territory, because she does have 2 entire provinces. She's going to crank up significant numbers of troops. Once Malekith comes into the fray after he's finished Grombrindal, he's going to throw a lot of stacks against you. Then there's the potential issue of Cathay, or the Sisters of Twilight. from my personal perspective, it's probably best to try and make an alliance with Cathay. He can make a pretty good ally. Then, of course, there's the issue of Morathi. So what I like about this campaign is it actually has a proper difficulty curve that goes up. It's easiest in the beginning, it's harder in the mid game, and even harder in the late game once you encounter more and more factions. Because even if you take down Be'lakor, Hellebrand, Sigvald, Valkia, Malekith, Morathi, none of which are easy legendary lords to deal with, to be very clear on this, you then still have the entirety of Norska gunning for you. You then still have the Chaos factions here in the Chaos Waste coming for you. And that means you're going to have issues to deal with. Then there's the potential of Nakari, because you do have a quest to take the Shrine of Cain. So you want to show up with an army, just take the Shrine of Cain, give it to Alariel, make a deal, and that's how you encounter the rest of Ulfion and start making deals with them. But you might end up having to deal with Nakari. The very late game can be a bit boring when it comes down to it, of course, unless you end up facing a unified Norska under Wulfric, who's going to throw everything in the kitchen sink against you. And Norska is quite very strong as a faction if they can unify. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. If they do, you're in for a world of trouble. But just bear in mind that even in the best case scenario, you're still going to face the hordes of Hellebrand and Be'lakor coming for your shores. You're still going to face Malekith. You're still potentially going to face Valkia or Sigvald, or maybe both of them during the course of your campaign. And this is within the first couple dozen turns of this campaign. So this is a campaign where you are a powerful faction, but you're facing many other powerful factions, and that's what makes it the best campaign from my perspective to play. It's great to play a powerful faction, but also have actual proper enemies who will give you a run for your money and actually force you to strategize, to think, to decide how you're going to do things, instead of just showing up with doom stacks at their border and annihilating them. It's just certainly an issue in a lot of campaigns. That's what I find so engaging about this campaign. Sure, you are still a High Elven faction, and ultimately High Elves are one of the more powerful races in the game, so eventually you can, in very, very, very late game, like I'd consider the proper late game when you're looking to achieve the long campaign victory condition. So in the very latter stages of that, you can end up steamrolling, but it is a journey. It requires effort, it requires planning. And this campaign can go sideways even if you do everything brilliantly in the early game, because then you just end up being swarmed by hordes of enemies that have many ways to attack your core territories here in the Broken Lands and the Granite Hills. So you need to be careful, you need to plan properly, you need to strategize properly, you need to pick your battles. You need to also decide on a proper campaign plan where you're going to go. My advice would be, take Karen Carr, deal with Silostra, take the Shrine of Cain, give it to Alariel, come back, and then decide if you're going to go west to deal with Tarks, maybe make an alliance with Cathay, or if you're going to try and push north to deal with Hellebrand, though just bear in mind you're going to deal with Valkia and Sigvald. You're going to come in contact with Valkia and Sigvald, and either of them or both of them will declare war on you, and Be'lakor is also going to be attacking you in the meantime, so just be aware of that. Costin here, signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, enable notifications. If you believe other campaigns are really good, feel free to add them. I think I would give an honorable mention to Grombrindle, who I think can have a very fun and engaging campaign that's very different than the other Dwarven campaigns, by the way. He can have a very fun and engaging campaign, and although dwarves are pretty weak, he does go a long way towards fixing quite a few of their problems, at least when it comes to casualty replenishment. He certainly helps a lot with that. Anyway, stay tuned. If you enjoy the content, donate via PayPal or Patreon. Links in the description. Would greatly appreciate your support, and I'll see you next time.